We are back on the road to City Hall. One of the goals of our show in this election year is to look closely at issues that will matter for the next mayor and to help voters make an informed decision about the issues and the candidates. Tonight we are looking at immigration. After many years of inaction, immigration reform appears to have become a priority for national lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. But what does that mean for us here in New York City? Joining me here in the studio to talk about the push for immigration reform and the growing influence of Latino voters nationally and locally, we've got Angela Fernandez, an immigration lawyer and the executive director of the Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights. Also with us, the publisher and editor-in-chief of Black Star News, Milton Alamati. Jackie Vimo is director of advocacy at the New York Immigration Coalition, and Philip Kazanitz is a professor of sociology at the University of New York's Graduate Center. Thank you all for joining us. Good to see you. And Jackie, let me start with you. We've heard all of this talk that after getting religion, after the shellacking in the national elections, the Republicans are now in favor of something in the way of reform of immigration policy. Democrats were there already. President seems to be on board. Does that really mean anything for us here in New York? And if so, what?
Well, I mean, I think that it means quite a bit here in New York, and and not only does it mean something in terms of the fact that nationally we have the first State of the Union response from the Republicans coming from Senator Rubio, who's going to give it in Spanish, but here in New York we actually really have a unique opportunity to contribute to the debate. New York has always been on the forefront of pushing the envelope on immigrant rights, on actually being a leader on immigrant rights. And I think that now really is the time for us to put our money where our mouth is. And when it comes to the upcoming mayoral elections, I think that we actually need to now more than ever recognize this as a reality. I mean, I think that there's many things that the mayoral candidates need to speak out on. For example, we know that because of the enforcement policies that have existed, that many Latinos and other immigrants and communities of color have been targeted under programs like Stop and Frisk. We know that there's been surveillance of Muslim communities, and we need the next mayoral candidate to be able to come forward and say this is not going to happen under the next administration. Mm-hmm. In addition, with health reform coming forward, there's going to be a larger need than ever for the city and the Health and Hospitals Corporation to actually be taking care of those who have been left out of reform. The undocumented population is specifically excluded from Obamacare. And so the city is actually going to need to step up and ensure that our hospitals, which have been providing care for the uninsured, actually are there to meet that need moving forward.
And, Professor, I mean, yeah. One of the things in your writing I came across recently is that 22% of our population in New York City is second generation, meaning we've got lots and lots of immigrants, and not all of them show up as non-citizens. A lot of them are, like you've written about, second generation. Doesn't that mean that most candidates for any significant office in New York are going to pretty much play to that segment of the population?
Well, one would hope so, but of course, an awful lot of the second generation are too young to vote. Or are younger adults and haven't gotten into the habit of voting yet. And an awful lot of adult immigrants, even legal permanent residents, don't have the right to vote yet. So, the polity doesn't look like the population to a considerable extent. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, because New York's had this long experience of immigration, there's an awful lot of immigrants who are voting, and presumably, I mean, every New York candidate says nice things about immigrants, right? It's part of our local religion here. So they're great for the economy, and they're great for the cultural diversity, et cetera, et cetera. The real question is, given all of that, in terms of the kind of social services we were just talking about, what are they going to do? And as more people become here legally, I think those issues become more important.
And Angela, there are really some legal issues here, right? I mean, New York undertakes through the state constitution of nowhere else an obligation to take care of the poor and so forth. And we're hearing that there's a specific exclusion from some vital services. What does that mean for the immigrant population?
Well, actually, I mean, there's some really interesting areas in which the candidates could look into. For example, the fact that immigrants that are detained or in deportation proceedings do not have a right to counsel because it's they're civil cases, unlike in criminal cases. Really? And so a study has just come out by the Katzman Group, which is federal Judge Katzman, looking at immigration issues. And that is an area where there's a severe need because when you have an immigrant who's detained having to fight their case against the government with limited language skills, the likelihood of them prevailing is, when they're detained, 3%. If they're not detained but in deportation proceedings, 13%. If they have counsel, then that increases tremendously. Their chances of prevailing increase 67%. What does that mean? That means that when they get representation, the likelihood of staying here with their families and staying with their community increases. So that's an area where New York could really have a pilot program for the rest of the country. And within the debate that's happening nationally, and well, there will be these many people who will be able to regularize, there are still going to be people that are going to get caught in the dragnet of the deportation system. And so we really have to think about how we're going to protect those people.
And Milton, tell us, how does this play out with the African community here in New York City?
Okay, well, for one thing, I think it will bring many of them from the shadows into the mainstream economy, of course. Many people may not be aware of it, but most African immigrants that come here actually have advanced degrees or graduate degrees. I think the estimate is about 50%. So these are people that would be able to participate in the economy. As we're all aware, the latest reports are that high-tech, there's a big demand in high-tech and skilled workers. So these Africans would be able to participate in the economy. And not only locally, because if it does become national policy, they would not only come to New York. New York is traditionally attracted a lot of immigrants because New York has been immigrant-friendly. But now they'll be able to move to other states where those jobs are available.
And you know, the striking thing, Professor, is that, you know, we're talking about national issues that are inevitably sort of lived out locally.
Right.
Is it time for there to be some kind of a national policy, or God forbid even an agency that deals with the welcoming or integration of immigrants? There's no such agency.
It's
right
remarkable that for all of our talk about being the nation of immigrants, we've never had a national agency or a national ministry of absorption in some sense. We've never had someone whose responsibility, and usually that falls on localities. And it falls on localities because they do the federal government sets who's coming in the broad immigration parameters. The tasks of educating their children, of dealing with health care, of dealing with criminal justice issues, these all fall on localities. And very often those localities haven't thought through really what it means to have immigrant communities. New York's actually probably ahead of a lot of localities.
The ultimate unfunded mandate.
Exactly.
Turn these people into Americans, and we will not only not give you the money, we'll set up a bunch of
we'll actually make it harder.
roadblocks, right? Is that the challenge?
I mean, I think that there's this other problem. I mean, this is why actually states and cities like New York need to actually be really active in these federal debates, because the fact of the matter is people are talking about imposing English requirements for people to be able to naturalize or to have some path to legalization. That's all fine and good, but as it stands right now, there are no spaces and there are no seats available in English as a second language classes here that are low cost here in the city of New York. The waiting lists are outrageous. People want to learn English, but with budget cuts and with fiscal austerity measures, we've seen a reduction in these kinds of initiatives. So it's going to be the city that's going to have to pick up the tab when there are huge numbers of, which is why actually we should be vocal when we talk, when we get involved in the national debate, say, we can't have an English requirement unless there's going to be corresponding funding.
I agree.
Okay, we've got more to talk about. We're going to do that in just a minute. Right now, though, we're going to take a short break. And also tonight, we're going to bring together a special panel to talk about the history of one of New York City's iconic landmarks, Grand Central Terminal, which turned 100 this month. We're back in a minute.